Ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, welcome back to the Appalachian Outfeed. And let me tell you, this right here is what victory looks like. So a couple of months ago, I splurged and got a Kawasaki Mule Pro FTXXT 1000 Ranch Edition Platinum 2025 year model. Got it, the last one they had on the lot. Bought that in September as the new 2026 ones were coming in, and got an okay deal on it. Probably saved me a few $100 buying the previous year model. And so I just got my 20 hours on the engine and running gear, and so I had to do that initial 20-hour break-in fluid change. So that's the front axle, rear axle, and the engine oil. And let me tell you, what should have taken me maybe an hour took me half a day. It was an exercise in frustration, and so we'll get into that. So here's what's going on. Well, before we get into that, let me give you some quick specs on what you're going to need to do this. First off, for the 2025 year model, you're going to want the Kawasaki oil filter, part number 16097-0007. So that is the engine oil filter, and you're going to need 3.8 quarts of engine oil. And then for the front axle, you're going to want a half a quart of oil for that, and for the rear axle, looking at 2 quarts. That's going to become important later on. As far as tools go, you're going to want a 17mm socket to drain for the drain plug on the engine, along with so the 17mm socket is going to do the engine drain plug and the rear axle drain plug. So that's kind of handy. Same socket size for both the engine and the rear axle. And then for the front axle, you're going to want an 8mm hex socket kind of deal. Yep. And again, so that's an 8mm. Come on, gloves, with the hex end on it. And you're going to need a socket. I don't think you're going to be able to do it with just a regular hex wrench. And then for the rear axle, same thing, but a 14mm hex driver. Okay, so fairly standard stuff. I got mine from Harbor Freight. The Pittsburgh stuff works just fine. Yep. All right, so that's the tools you're going to need. So 17mm socket, 8mm hex, and a 14mm hex for the rear axle. So on the rear axle, that's for the fill plug, and on the front axle, the 8mm hex does both the fill plug and the drain plug. Now, here's my first pro tip for you. When you're doing anything like this, where that involves a drain and fill, and you've got a threaded opening on the fill plug, go ahead and crack that fill plug loose first. So that way, if something goes hinky with the fill plug, you don't drain the fluid out, and then you're left with an empty axle that you can't fill with fluid, if you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, anytime you got a threaded fastener on a drain and fill type situation for the fill plug, go ahead and crack that fill plug loose first, and then you can go ahead and drain your stuff out, and you know everything's going to work out okay. And that starts to get into why this ended up being so difficult. So Kawasaki, in the owner's manual, does give you torque specs for everything, to include the engine oil filter. What they also do is apparently they install every fastener on this thing with the biggest impact Kawasaki has. Good gracious. So I started with the engine, and my first attempt at turning wrenches, actually no, that's not true. So the first thing I did was, after I cracked the fill plug on the rear end, I went ahead and drained the engine oil. So for the engine oil, you're going to want to snake in on the passenger side right in front of the rear tire, and you're looking for an oval shaped hole in the skid plate underneath the Mule, if yours has that skid plate. So there's an oval shaped hole. I could not get up underneath there. I wasn't on ramps or anything. It was on a flat concrete surface. I could not get my big old body up underneath there to actually see the plug. I'm doing this all by feel. So again, snake in right ahead of the right rear tire, and you'll see that oval opening on the skid plate, and pop your socket in there, and you can break that sucker loose. That was fairly tight. It wasn't crazy, but it was pretty tight. It was more than the 15 foot-pounds that the manual calls for, but it wasn't crazy. That drain plug also has a crush washer on it, so if you're not replacing that, which you should, I didn't, but if you're not replacing it, you do want to make sure that you retain that crush washer. When you fill up around the drain plug, the drain hole with your finger, because again, you can't get your eyeballs, I couldn't get my eyeballs up to it. It does feel, there's a molded rim on that drain hole that feels like the washer is stuck to the bottom of the pan. That is not the washer. It's a little aluminum piece, and mine dropped into the pan, and I had to fish it out after I drained some oil out. So be aware of that. So we got the fill plug off, and I went ahead while it was warm. I ran it around a little bit before I started all this. Went ahead and did the rear axle, used my hex key socket on it, dropped that drain plug. That thing was fairly tight. It was pretty tight. It wasn't crazy, but again, it's tighter than the 15 or 17 pounds they call for in the manual. But got that out okay, and so all this stuff is draining out. Then I turned my attention to the engine oil filter, and that's where we ran into an issue. So, you know, I did not have a filter wrench that fit on the head of the filter appropriately, so I was having to, you know, use other things. So I had you know, the little cam type wrenches. That did not work. I tried a strap wrench. That did not work, and the problem is the filter's kind of tucked down. You've got a fuel line and your spark plug lines, cables, good Lord, in the way of all this. It's not inaccessible, but it's hard to get anything with a handle down in there. So in any event, I could not get that oil filter to turn for anything, and I ended up with a large pair of pliers, and I'm clamping down across the top of the filter, and you can see how it's crushed in. So I'm clamping down like this with the pliers, trying to get the thing to turn, you know, like that. And you can see the results. I wrecked this thing. And what I ended up doing was using those pliers. Well, I couldn't get enough clamp on it and twist at the same time because, again, of all the stuff that was in the way, and it just wasn't working out. So I ended up putting a crescent wrench over the top of the pliers, and then putting a long screwdriver through the hole in the crescent wrench, and got my wife out there to try to torque on that thing to break this thing loose. No, not working. We tried that several different times. I tried re-gripping this thing, but again, you can see I had a hold of this thing, and this thing was not turning. I thought I was gonna have to get in a truck and ride to town and find a new strap type oil filter wrench to get this thing to break loose. I'd already wrecked one, but it was a little bit older and it was already weakened by some previous antics. So that thing, I wrecked that thing. But before, as I'm standing there looking at it, what I realized is if I could get the pliers to clamp on the side of the filter like this instead of across the top, if I could get a hold of it like this, I could probably get that thing to turn. So what I ended up doing was taking the little kick panel loose. That's it's for the rear seat passengers, and it's a kick panel that fits up under the seat, runs from the seat to the floor. You can pop that panel, I say pop the loose. So you got to take the rear seat out to get this panel loose. So there's 2 bolts on each side of the rear seat. But you got to back those dudes out. Those things were in there tight, like tighter than they needed to be. But I got those 2 things out, the 2 brackets off of the rear seat. And then at the bottom of the rear seat, and we'll get over here in a second and show you, but it has these little Phillips head fasteners, and I thought they were going to be sheet metal screws, but they're not. They are just a threaded fastener. These guys, so it's just a Phillips head screw. Oh no. These guys were in there so freaking tight. I started with a hand screwdriver, a Klein screwdriver. All I was succeeding in doing was about to strip the threads out, or strip the head off that Phillips head. That was pretty aggravating. I ended up having to go get a little M12 Milwaukee impact to bust those things loose. It was ridiculous. And even then, I had to really push on the impact, digging into the Phillips head so it didn't just strip the head of the screw out. Why that's in there, I mean, I guess they don't want it to vibrate loose. Mission accomplished, Kawasaki. So I finally get that little kick panel loose, and I just loosened it on the engine side, on the passenger side. Well, I did take everything loose over there, but I didn't pop it out of place on the driver's side. And that allowed me to get my big old set of pliers in there and get sideways on the oil filter. And once I was able to clamp down sideways on it, I was able to scooch that thing loose. But let me tell you, it was like they installed that thing with an impact and JB weld on the threads. It was, you know, I don't know how many foot-pounds that was, 30, 40. It was dumb. The manual calls for 13 foot-pounds for that engine oil filter. And that was just, it was on there way, way tighter than that. So there you go. All that to say this: if you're having trouble getting the oil filter off of one of these things, you know, the first initial install, pull that little panel off and get on there and get on the side of the oil filter with some pliers, and you'll be able to break it loose. You're going to need some, you know, decent sized pliers, but you can break it loose that way. And you know, you're not tearing anything up, and you're not running into these spark plug wires or the fuel line or anything like that. So it was kind of a hassle. You know, the reinstall on the seat, you got these 2 brackets you got to line up, and you know, it's a little bit of a headache, but it wasn't bad. It was way better than having to load up and go to the store and try to find some filter wrench that was going to fit this thing. I will say this: even if I'd have had one of those socket type wrenches that fit on the oil filter, on the, you know, the little ridges on the cap, I don't think that would have worked. I think I would have stripped that thing out as tight as that filter was on there. And those oil filters, you know, they got that thin wall metal on there that the filter body's made out of. I don't think it would have worked. I think it would have rounded that off, and I'd have been back to square one. So pulling that kick panel loose, I think that's going to be the answer. The other thing that I ended up doing, well, discovering, is both of the fuel plugs on the axles, both the rear and the front, are inaccessible with regular gear oil. Now, the gear oil I had was Kawasaki brand. It came in just like a regular quart jug. It didn't have the little squirty spout thing on there like other gear oils do. I don't know that I could have used that anyway. What I did end up doing was building me a funnel with an extension. So this was a funnel that I already had, and I thought it was going to work, but once I got to looking at it, I was like, yep, there's no way this is going to work. So the front of this thing that we'll look at in a second, it's got a bumper and a winch. And I had to pull the entire front bumper off to be able to access the fill plug on the front axle. And I was able to snake this thing in there down into the fill plug. Now this is a 1/2 inch PEX A pipe. This is some PEX pipe I had. I didn't even have to cut it. It worked out to be the perfect length for the front and the rear. And I'm going to say this is maybe 30 inches, something like that. Just the PEX part of it. But so I was able to snake this thing in, and this 1/2 inch PEX A just does fit in the front fill hole on the front axle. For the rear axle, you got a bigger hole. This thing fit right down in there, no problem. And the length on this thing, and I'll try to show you here in a second, it fit just right down in that rear axle fill hole, and this was up above the bumper, and I was able to sit there and pour it in. Now, for whatever reason, it was about probably 40 degrees when I was doing this. The gear oil is a little thick, but man, it took forever to fill this thing up using this. It just didn't want to, run down, because it didn't have any way to, let air past the oil running down a tube. So it was strictly like gravity feed. I don't know. It took a long time to get 2 quarts in there, which brings me to my last point about all this. On the rear axle in particular, it calls for 2 quarts in owner's manual, and thank goodness they call that out, because the way that you tell that the thing is filled up is got these 2 little it's got this notch and these 2 little humps in there, and you're supposed to get it halfway in up these notches between the bumper and the muffler. I could not really get an angle with my eyeball to look in there and be able to tell that I had the correct amount of oil in there. So what I ended up doing, you know what I did? I had to get my phone out and take video and stick it up in there and try to see using my phone, and that actually worked. It actually worked pretty well. But eyeball wise, could not do it. I could get close, but between the glasses and everything, I just couldn't see in there well enough to be confident that that I had the right amount of oil in it. Now, having said all that, I did it. The rear axle was draining while I'm jacking around with this engine oil filter for hours, a couple of hours. So the rear axle had drained completely by the time I got back around to filling it up. So I felt pretty good about just dumping the 2 quarts in there and knowing I was going to be pretty close on my quantity. And sure enough, that worked out just right. But yeah, you won't do this without a funnel with an extension on it. And you're going to have a tough time seeing if you've been able to fill it up. Again, on the front fill plug, I've got a winch and a bumper on there. I was able to snake this past there and kind of move it off to the side. And it takes a 1/2 quart, and I did the same thing because it was a little tough seeing past the winch bracket, and it just wasn't great. But that's a much more straightforward fill thing. You just fill it up to the drain plug or the fill plug hole, and you're done. So you almost can't overfill it because it's going to run out the front of the fill plug. So let me take you guys around here and I'll show you what I'm talking about real quick. So sitting here, I've got the end of the tube sitting right on the fill hole. And so you can see what this gives me back here at the rear bumper. And so I was able just to kind of hold it in here with one hand and pour it in with the other. And that worked out pretty good. So on the front, again, the bumper has to come off because it's got a bracket under here, like a little plate, a little protective guard. And you can see the fill plug in there, but you can't get to it, even though it's got some slots cut in there. But you snake that thing in there and use that to fill your front transaxle. All right, so that's everything. That went way longer than I expected, but hopefully that'll save some of you guys some problems down the road. And again, this is on a 2025 Kawasaki Mule with that 999cc engine. Okay, well, that's all I've got for you, and I appreciate it. Appreciate you watching, and we will see you next time.